You may have seen discussions of astrotheology before. If you want to call it by that name, it does have some drawbacks. Astromythology might be better, or celestial mythology, or simply star myths. Many of these discussions only go as far as tying the actions in the myths and stories to the sun's motion through the year, through the solstices and the equinoxes, occasionally with some reference to the 12 signs of the zodiac. Few realize that virtually all the myths of virtually every culture on the planet describe the interactions of characters who are based on very specific constellations with recognizable characteristics that are part of a coherent system worldwide. The figure of Samson in the book of Judges can be shown to be a celestial figure, and the jawbone weapon that he uses corresponds to specific stars in the sky, namely the Hyades in the constellation of Taurus. The authors of Hamlet's Mill provide evidence that this same celestial weapon shows up in other myths all around the globe, including among Native American peoples in parts of South America and the Caribbean, where a mythical hero uses a weapon made from the jawbone of a tapir. This book, published in 1943, states very directly that the Native Americans of Guyana called the stars of the Hyades the jawbone of the tapir, and there are much earlier accounts from the first half of the 1700s which were already discussing myths among the Maipuri of the rainforest and river areas of Guyana and among the Arawak of the Caribbean, in which a jawbone of a tapir features as a weapon. Still further around the globe, from the cultures whose scriptures contain the story of Samson, there are specific stories among the Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in which the god or demigod or culture hero Maui uses the jawbone of his own grandmother, Murironga Whenua, as a weapon with which he clubs the sun, and which he later fashions into the fishhook with which, in some accounts, he fishes up the northern island from the deep. We'll see why the connection to specific constellations is important momentarily. But it's important to also point out that the conclusions which are often drawn by those who look at the connections between the events in the scriptures of the New Testament, for instance, and the motions of the sun, often imply that because the stories dramatize heavenly phenomena, their significance today is negligible. And that's because many commentators conclude that the reason that the myths encode heavenly cycles involved preservation in ancient times of the calendar cycles for agricultural purposes, or perhaps the preservation of sophisticated knowledge of advanced astronomical motions, including the orbital cycles of various planets, and even the ages-long motion of precession. There's also another category of commentators who fall into one of the various ancient astronaut or ancient alien schools of thought, and who argue that ancient myths may point to star systems from which certain ancient visitors to Earth may have originated. But I've reached a very different conclusion based on several factors, including my own experience analyzing this worldwide system of celestial metaphor over the course of several years, as well as hints that we can glean from ancient surviving texts from authors such as Apuleius, Plato, Ovid, Macrobius, and Lucian of Samosata, among others, as well as the insights of esoterists from previous decades and centuries, including Gerald Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, and R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. And that is that this ancient system of celestial metaphor is designed to impart intuitive understanding of truths which cannot be seen, truths which involve the invisible realm, the realm of spirit, the realm of the gods, the realm of non-ordinary reality, and the fact that this apparently material world actually flows out of and is at all times interpenetrated by this spiritual realm, as well as truths about our purpose in coming into this simultaneously physical and spiritual existence in the first place, the question of why are we here? Alvin Boyd Kuhn perceived evidence that the world's ancient myths, including the stories in the Bible but also going back to the myths and symbols of ancient Egypt, use various heavenly cycles to impart deep knowledge pertaining to different stations on the soul's journey, including incarnation at fall equinox and spiritual quickening at winter solstice, although his analysis of the stories themselves generally stopped short of assigning specific constellations to specific personages. An exception is his analysis of the reasons to find some connection between the ancient goddesses Isis and Nephthys and the zodiac stations of Virgo and Pisces. Now, the reason this is so important is because as we gain a more comprehensive understanding of the celestial language used by this ancient system of metaphor, we can begin to perceive that certain mythical episodes correspond to very specific constellations, which can point us to very specific places on the great cycle of the year, for example, which in turn correspond, under the system outlined by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, to very specific turning points in the spiritual progress of the human soul through the experience of incarnating in this simultaneously material spiritual realm in which we presently find ourselves. This understanding of the celestial and metaphorical language employed by the myths opens up a completely different understanding of the message of the world's ancient scriptures and sacred stories. They are not primarily about the various times of planting or harvest or the preservation of calendrical or even astronomical knowledge, as important as all that knowledge can undoubtedly be shown to have been for men and women living in previous centuries or millennia. But if that's all that the ancient myths were designed to convey, they may not be seen as being extremely relevant today, other than for the sake of historical knowledge, since we now have other ways of preserving astronomical cycles, or for those of us involved in agriculture, staying in tune with the cycles of the crops and planting and harvesting. However, if the myths that were imparted to humanity as an ancient treasure and preserved all around the world in various forms of celestial metaphor, all using a common system, are in fact about our purpose here in this incarnate life, and about the way that we should act towards other men and women, and about bringing our mind and our body and our senses into harmony and reliance upon our higher self, as described in various texts from ancient India, such as the Upanishads. And if the ancient scriptures are even about, as Alvin Boyd Kuhn asserts based on his analysis of the scriptures of ancient Egypt, about the creation of an immortal spiritual body by the pursuit of certain disciplines during this incarnate existence, a spiritual body which will enable us at last to transcend the cycle of incarnation, then they are extremely relevant to our daily life, even in the modern era. If we insist on trying to read the ancient scriptures through a literalist lens, we will likely miss the above urgent messages, because a literalist reading causes us to mistakenly understand the myths as speaking about someone else when they are trying to teach us something about our own situation. But even if we understand that they are not literal, and even if we begin to perceive that they're based on celestial metaphor of some sort, we can still miss their intended message if we mistakenly conclude that they're all about ancient people preserving knowledge used for agriculture or timing the harvest. Schwaller de Lubitsch argued that the esoteric method was not designed for hiding knowledge, but rather that its purpose was to impart knowledge to the intelligence of the heart, knowledge which cannot be grasped through any other method. I have spent some years now examining the evidence that the myths, scriptures, and sacred stories of the world are not literal, but rather that they are based on a system of celestial metaphor, and that the stories in the Old and New Testament of the Bible are part of this ancient star myth system. My purpose in explaining this system to others is not to devalue the scriptures in any way, including the stories found in the scriptures of the Bible. Quite the contrary, it's my belief that the understanding of this system of celestial metaphor, which can be positively demonstrated with hundreds of specific examples to be operating in the myths and sacred stories of the world, enables us to perceive their esoteric message and helps prevent egregious misinterpretations which have had and continue to have regrettable consequences in the world, and shows us that these ancient treasures given to the human race are by no means obsolete or simply historical or literary curiosities, but rather that they contain essential knowledge for our lives right now, wherever we are and in whatever circumstances we happen to find ourselves.